Did Joseph Smith institute the priesthood ban on Black people in the LDS Church? So, this episode, we're really going to dig into this question. Specifically, we're going to look at two secondary sources. One from an individual named Stephen G. Taggart, and the other from Lester Bush. Both of these articles really important studies on the racial priesthood ban in the LDS Church, and both of them leading to different conclusions. We're going to start off with Stephen Taggart. And Taggart, if we look, he ends up writing an article which eventually turns into an 86-page book, pretty short. It's more an article, but publishes it as a book. And his thesis is really going to be that the policy began with Joseph Smith in 1834. This is really problematic. On a previous episode, I talked a little bit about 1852, specifically February 5th, 1852, where Brigham Young in the new Utah Territory in front of the territorial legislature lays out what is going to be the racial priesthood ban that lasts from 1852 to 1978. Therefore, how does Stephen Taggart get to the point that Joseph Smith started the ban in 1834? And this is really going to delve into something known as the Missouri Thesis, that Joseph Smith, reacting to what had happened to the Saints in their Missouri experiments with the extermination order and being kicked out and individuals being killed, and largely there's this belief that the antagonism between the Missourians and the Saints trying to settle in Missouri was caused over Joseph Smith and the LDS Church having some liberal egalitarian views toward freed blacks and or slaves themselves. We have a northeasterner Yankee coming down to Missouri and possibly bringing with him some of that abolitionist rhetoric. So this idea of 1834 being the birth of the priesthood ban is going to have to start with that. Joseph Smith is going to see what happens because he has a more liberal view on the issue of slavery and blacks living together with whites, and that's going to cause some problems in Missouri. Therefore, Stephen Taggart's really going to argue the idea that Joseph Smith, after seeing what happens in Missouri, he's going to react and do a 180, which is going to lead to the birth of the priesthood ban. So where does he actually get this? Well, this is a recurring problem in Mormon history when people are arguing when things actually start. We see documents that are not contemporary to the actual issue. So Stephen Taggart arguing that the ban is starting in 1834, but he's going to use as his main evidence a document from May 1st, 1879. This is his primary evidence. It comes from the John Nuttall journals, and we're going to see specifically a statement from a high member of the church, Zebedee Coltrane, and he's going to recount that Joseph Smith says that this Negro has no right and cannot hold the priesthood. And we actually end up seeing this backed up by another individual, supposedly that had spoken to Joseph Smith, mainly Abraham Smoot. His testimony in the same document, it supports Coltrane's account. So we have two individuals coming together saying that Joseph Smith told them in the 1830s that African Americans had no right to the priesthood. This is the basis for what Taggart sees as the origin for the priesthood bans. And he goes on to dig into, well, we can really see Joseph Smith developing these ideas because when he translates the book of Abraham, we see some teachings there that show that maybe he doesn't view African Americans or those of African descent as equal. So what's the problem with this argument? Well, if you're a historian, it just doesn't hold water at all. Now let's jump to Lester Bush. So Lester Bush, he's going to directly challenge Stephen Taggart's conclusions. And eventually he's going to write a big article of his own where he's going to say that the priesthood ban actually started with Brigham Young, which is correct. And he's really going to reason why Stephen Taggart's research is flawed from the beginning. The big problem here is going to be the documents that Taggart is relying on for his thesis. He's relying on a document from 1879 where these two individuals in the Nuttall journals are talking to John Taylor, and John Taylor's trying to confirm whether or not blacks should or shouldn't have the priesthood. And again, this being many years later, 4 decades later, we have a big problem with the reliability of these statements, a la what we talked about before with the W. Phelps documents, trying to date so many things back to Joseph Smith. Why? The question of if Joseph Smith said it, then it's church doctrine. Whereas if somebody else says it, then we can question it. So trying to date things back to Joseph Smith is extremely important for these early saints. There is something really important. While Taggart is trying to say that the priesthood ban began in 1834, and then he's saying that another person talked to Joseph Smith in 1835, if this is true, and this is where Joseph Smith tells these individuals that no black man should have the priesthood, there's one fatal flaw to this argument, and that comes in the form of Elijah Abel. Elijah Abel, documentation, primary source documentation shows us that Joseph Smith issues and signs his ministerial certificate or his priesthood certificate in 1836, which is after he is supposedly telling both Smoot and Coltrane that blacks should not have the priesthood. We also have that Elijah Abel's priesthood is confirmed to be active as late as 1883, where church leaders are trying to converse on the topic of should blacks ever have had the priesthood, or was it a mistake? 1883, we see Elijah Abel be brought up, and church leaders confirm that, yeah, his priesthood is legit. So this is a fatal flaw. Couple that with the fact that Q. Walker Lewis gets his priesthood from William Smith in the 1840s. So we have a big problem here with at least 2 documented individuals of African descent receiving priesthood after Joseph Smith supposedly said that blacks shouldn't have the priesthood. So if Joseph Smith implements the ban in 1834, why then would black men be ordained just 2 years later? Well, the problem is he didn't institute the ban. So why then do we see racial language in the Book of Mormon? Why do we see racial language in the Book of Abraham? Contextually speaking, the world that Joseph Smith is growing up in, the antebellum period, the 19th century, the thought patterns of the day, the predominant thought patterns are not those of abolitionism. They're not those of equality between races. The era that Joseph Smith is writing in, whether you believe that he translated the Book of Mormon from plates or it's his own work, what we're really seeing is Joseph Smith is creating a document in the middle of racial tension in the United States. Therefore, it makes sense with the Book of Mormon and the Book of Abraham being 19th century pieces of work that we're going to see those themes make their way into the document. If it is a book for that time period, it makes sense that your audience would want to connect to something that seems real and seems legitimate and speaks to them. Therefore, the racial tension makes sense that it makes it into both documents, the Book of Mormon and the Book of Abraham. Where we actually see some of Joseph Smith's own words come out would be the Doctrine and Covenants. And he says, that no man should be in bondage to one another. Therefore, if we're looking at Joseph Smith's actual teachings versus the contextual time period teachings, thus why we see these competing narratives in the Book of Abraham and Book of Mormon versus the Doctrine and Covenants. And this is not to be apologetic for Joseph Smith. This is just speaking that Joseph Smith in 1834 is not implementing a priesthood ban when 2 years later Joseph Smith is signing a ministerial certificate for a black man himself. Interestingly enough, Stephen Taggart throws in a little footnote on, I believe, page 62 of his book, where he says, there is this incident of this guy named Elijah Abel, but I'm not going to talk about that here because it has nothing to do with my research. It has nothing to do with his research because it would completely undermine everything. One simple fact would undermine the rest of the research entirely, and Taggart would have nothing to stand on, which is what Lester Bush really focuses on and pushes towards. And we'll talk a little bit more about Lester Bush in a later video. So back to the initial question here. Did Joseph Smith implement the priesthood ban in 1834? It's a resounding no. The priesthood ban was implemented, and historians such as Matthew Harris, Paul Reeve, they have written extensively about this, myself in my dissertation, and the consensus appears to be that Brigham Young in 1852 institutes the priesthood ban in the Utah Territory. It's not Joseph Smith. So why did Taggart omit this crucial information? Why did Taggart want to place the priesthood ban on Joseph Smith? My belief as a historian here and understanding some of the inner workings of Mormonism, individuals look to place things on Joseph Smith because Joseph Smith, as the founder, his works seem to be less questioned by those in the orthodoxy. Therefore, by placing the ban on Joseph Smith, it provides a clear narrative that this wasn't necessarily a racist teaching, that it came from the founding prophet from the beginning, which takes a little bit of the ownership off of Brigham Young. We can't say that Brigham Young is just a straight out racist who created this if Joseph Smith taught that, and many of the Orthodox members are not going to question that fact if it comes from Joseph Smith. We're coming from Brigham Young in 1852. After Joseph Smith had done things very differently, it leads Orthodox members room to question. So again, ending this video here, Joseph Smith did not create the priesthood ban. The historical evidence of ordinations during his lifetime and his later anti-slavery statements strongly suggest otherwise. The ban was a policy that emerged and was solidified by subsequent church leaders, notably Brigham Young, who used the curse of Cain to justify it. So Stephen Taggart, I'm sorry, your document just doesn't work. Thanks for joining me today on the Great and Spacious Building. I look forward to more videos if you want to delve deeper into the priesthood ban, racial teachings of the church in upcoming videos. Like this video, comment below if you have any questions or want to add anything or start a discussion, and subscribe to the channel so you can see future videos about the topic. Thanks so much and have a great day.